thank you, Said, for that slightly exaggerated introduction. My name is Ali, and I'm a third-year medic at Emmanuel College, and I'm studying psychology in third year because third year is chill and we can do stuff like psychology, so it's fun. The way sort of this was set up initially is that we were discussing sort of ways of increasing academic attainment throughout our society, and we thought we'd sort of have like, a 5-10 minute talk in the prayer room for about 5 or 6 people about, how to revise for exams. And then somehow the whole university clocked that it was on Facebook, and we have a lot of people here. So, yeah, I'm really not an expert in this field at all. I just enjoy the subject and have looked a little bit into it. So I'm just going to be giving you a brief summary of some of the techniques that you can use to sort of maximize your success when revising for exams. And yeah, let's go for it. Next slide, please. So yeah, quick preface, I'm not an expert, as I've just said. I'm just studying the subject, so please don't attack me for saying something wrong, that kind of thing. Also, the nature of psychology studies is that you have to make generalizations. So I'm going to be telling you a few things that sort of you might have tried that might not work for you, and some things which I'm going to say are not very good, which you do all the time. If you came top 10 in Tri-Plus last year by just highlighting, then please just keep doing that. It's all about the generalizations. What I'm going to tell you is sort of, generally speaking, the majority of studies have found that the majority of people benefit from these techniques. But there is a lot of individual variation, so please don't attack me for that. And finally, because psychology is really fun, we're going to be including some graphs and results from studies and things. If you don't care about those, then you can feel free to ignore them. But yeah, let's get started. So, a brief overview of the 5 main things that will, in theory, increase your memory retention and storage capacity and everything. Firstly, practice. Secondly, deeper and more elaborative processing. Thirdly, organization. Fourthly, distributed practice. And fifthly, the most underrated, which is active retrieval. A lot of this stuff is obvious, but some of it is not so obvious. And I think if you understand the evidence base behind some of it, it would convince you to actually adopt these techniques. So next slide, please. So the first one, practice makes perfect. Everyone knows this to be the case. It's fairly intuitive. This is the classic forgetting curve. So you start off at 100% knowledge, and a few days later you forget all of it, and then you revise again, and then this keeps on happening. I don't know if you can see from the back, but what actually happens with this curve is that every time you revise something, the forgetting process becomes more shallow. So over here you forget everything within 2 days, there you forget a few more things within maybe 5 days, a week, a month, whatever. So this is how this sort of practice process works. But this is quite obvious. The other important thing is that the more times you practice something, the more times you revise a topic, the easier it becomes to relearn the topic. So everyone has had this feeling, I've had it many times. You study something and then a week later you look at it again and you realize you've forgotten absolutely all of it and there's nothing to remember, and you kind of think that, oh, it was a waste of time. Why did I spend sort of some time in Michaelmas revising this topic when I don't remember any of it come Easter? However, studies have actually shown that the more time you study a topic, the easier it becomes to relearn and retain, and this guy, Ebbinghaus, in 1985 was the big pioneer of this, and this was a big deal at the time. So don't worry if you forget something, it just becomes easier to relearn it once you sort of keep practicing it. Okay, secondly, when you talk about depth and elaboration of processing, that's another big way to sort of maximize the amount of stuff that gets retained in your memory. Craig and Tulving in 1975 did quite an interesting study where they had 3 groups of people and they gave them loads and loads of random words to memorize. So words like table, crate, market, friend, cloud, etc. The interesting thing was, for each of these different groups, they asked them to do different things with the words. In the first group, they asked, is the word in capital letters? And they just had to say yes or no. And that's how they sort of looked at the words. The second group was a rhyming thing. As you can see, does the word rhyme with weight? So obviously crate rhymes with weight, but market doesn't. And the participants in the study had to decide that for themselves. And finally, would the word fit in the sentence? He met a friend in the street, he met a cloud in the street. Obviously doesn't work. If you could have the next slide, please. So this shows, on the y-axis we have response latency. That basically means the amount of time people took to answer this question. As you can see, the thing about the capital letters only took about maybe 500 milliseconds. The thing about the rhyming took a bit longer, and putting the word into the sentence took the longest time of all, about 700 milliseconds. The theory behind this is that the longer the amount of time it takes you to decide or to pick an answer, that in theory means that you're engaging more brain processes and that it's a harder question. So obviously anyone can decide whether something has capital letters, but it takes a little bit more sort of cognitive ability to decide whether it would fit in the sentence. So that was the trend from these things. And if we go to the results now, this shows you that on the y-axis we have proportion recognized as a percentage. So the people who were just looking at capital letters only got about 20% of them right. The people who were looking at whether it rhymes or not got about 40%. But the people who actually put those words into sentences in their head, even though it took an extra maybe 300 milliseconds, which is really nothing at all, it ended up getting them about 80% of the questions right. And if we go next slide, please. So that basically was the first result to ever highlight the fact that the deeper and more elaborately you process something, the more likely it is to stick in your mind. And we'll go over towards the end of this section a little bit, sort of take-home messages from this. The other way to increase the amount of sort of retention is elaborative interrogation. Now this is a very long word, but it basically stems from this one study. So if we could have the first one. They divided participants into two groups. The first group was told the doctor hated the lawyer, and the second group was told the doctor hated the lawyer because of the malpractice suit. So there's not much difference between the two things. And then the test case, after they sort of had lots of statements of this nature, was the doctor hated who? And the participants had to decide, had to basically fill in the blank. Now the interesting thing was, about 50% of the participants in group 1 got this question right, but about 75% of them in group 2 got the question right. And the only difference was, group 2 had one sort of extra reason given for that. Now the theory that Anderson and Bauer came up with was that when you give a reason for a fact, you're increasing the number of cues that your memory can use to retrieve that information. So for example, you might remember off the top of your head that the doctor hated the lawyer, okay, fair enough. But if you forgot that bit, then subconsciously you might actually remember that, oh, it was a malpractice suit. Oh right, I remember now, that was the lawyer. And therefore more people were sort of knowing about, filling in the blank, or more people were able to fill in the blank once they had this elaborative processing. So what this means for us is that when revising a topic, in theory, we should try and get deeper and deeper into the topic. Because even if you don't need to know it for your exams, the fact that you're going deeper into it actually helps you understand the general picture which you do need for your exams much better. And finally, this is quite an interesting study. It was involving sort of the intent to remember. So a lot of us might have felt at one point in our lives, you sort of sit down and actively try and learn something. So what these guys, Hyde and Jenkins, did is that they got two groups of people. The first group had to sort of, and both groups had like a list of random words. The first group had to think about what the word meant to them and think about how they felt about the word. It might be good. If the word was good, they would feel happy about it. If the word was sad, they would feel bad about it, that kind of thing. And the second group of people had to see the same words, but all they had to do was assess whether there were any vowels or consonants or certain consonants in those words. Crucially as well, half the people in each group were told that they were going to be tested about it on those words, and the other half were not. And if we go to the graph, we can see what the difference is. So the incidental learning group, as in the ones who weren't told that they were going to get tested, versus the intentional learning group, the ones who were told you've got a test on this, so make sure you memorize them. There is pretty much no difference between the groups. Therefore, whether you intend to learn something or not makes very, very, very little difference to whether you actually learn it or not. The thing that does make the difference is that the group who rated the pleasantness of the word, how they felt about it, got significantly higher sort of questions right on this test than the people who just looked at the letters. Obviously, thinking about how a word makes you feel is quite deep processing. Thinking about whether it has the letter E in it is quite shallow processing. So again, this just highlights that the deeper you process something, the more likely it is to stick in your memory. And to take home messages from this sort of second point, intending to learn something doesn't really help. There's a little caveat with that, in that if you do intend to learn something, then your chances of actually adopting these techniques are higher, but let's ignore that for now. Thinking about stuff deeply does help. So in general, when doing exams, when doing revision, you want to think about what the material means in relation to everything else, and you want to think about what the material means in relation to you if that's relevant for your subject, whatever your subject might be. And again, all of it ultimately boils down to increasing the number of cues available for retrieval. Sort of like with that malpractice example, if you forget one thing, then you might remember something else that triggers that memory, and that's exactly what you want when you're revising for your exams. Okay, so far we've discussed practice, and we've discussed deeper and more elaborative processing. these are all reasonably obvious. The other three are a little bit more underrated, so I think you might find them quite useful. So, organization. Again, the objective as always is that we're increasing the number of cues. And if we go next slide, please. The seminal study on this was done in 1969, a long time ago, where they had loads of people try and memorize these random words like platinum, silver, gold, copper, lead, iron. They had two groups of people. One group were just given the words and told to sort of learn them, and the other groups were given the words in this sort of hierarchy. And as I'm sure you can guess, if you looked at the different groups, the ones who got it organized into the hierarchy got hugely better results than the ones who did it in a random order. So what does this mean for us? This means that we should be trying to sort of categorize and organize this information that we get when revising for our exams as much as we possibly can. Because again, this increases the number of cues available for retrieval. This sounds like quite a long phrase, but ultimately that's what we're trying to do. I'm going to give an example from second year pathology, because I'm a medic. So in pathology, you have loads and loads of bacteria to learn. You have to learn what they do, what they look like, how they cause damage, how they enter cells. Now, the traditional way of learning this would be sort of going bacteria by bacteria, doing one at a time, saying that, oh, E. coli causes damage by this and it enters the cell by that. Maybe Staphylococcus causes damage with this and enters with that. But a much more efficient way to do it is by effectively creating essay questions for yourself that actually engage all these different sort of information areas. So, for example, how do gram-negative bacteria cause damage? Gram-negative is just a classification of bacteria. So, just as a quick example, if we go to the next slide. If we take this question, we can split that up into direct damage and indirect damage. We can split up direct damage into exotoxins and some other stuff. Within those, we have different categories. So this is effectively that sort of flowchart of minerals that we discussed in the previous slide, where you can categorize everything, and ultimately, with a structure like this, you do end up learning everything you need to know, because it actually works. So it's a good thing to do. And take home message, yeah. Structure revision in the form of essay questions, if this is appropriate. This probably doesn't apply to like mathmos and engineers and stuff, but hey, you should group things into categories rather than learning them in an arbitrary order. And finally, spider diagrams are actually very, very good. There have been loads of studies on specifically on spider diagrams and like mind maps and that kind of thing. And the best thing about these is not that they look pretty, but it's that they force you to categorize things. And whenever you're forced inwardly sort of to generate a categorization for anything, the chances of you remembering it are much, much higher. Okay, so practice, people processing, and organization. Let's talk about distributed practice now. And I can't really say any better than this sort of famous professor guy who's quite a big name in psychology. So if you all want to have a read of this. Yeah, although cramming is better than not studying at all in the short term, given the same amount of time to study, would students be better off spreading out their study of content? The answer to this question is a resounding yes. Next slide, please. So, this guy, Barik, in 1979, had loads of kids, or students, I think they were actually our age, memorize the meanings of various Spanish words. And there were three groups of people. The first group of people had 6 training sessions where they sort of reviewed and stuff. But that all happened in one day, sort of one after the other. The second group had these 6 training sessions split apart by a day, so one day and then the next day and the next day. And the third group had these 6 training sessions spread out over 6 months. So every month they would have a training session. And I'm sure you can guess what the results were if you want to. So if you look right at the top, this black group was the one who just studied it all in one day. By the end of the day, they were actually getting quite good, getting close to almost 100% of them correct. But as sort of is fairly obvious, when they were tested 30 days later, their performance dropped by like 30%, which is the difference between like a first and a third. The people who revised sort of one session a day, like one training session every day, were actually quite good. So they started off pretty bad, and then they got very good. And then 30 days after their final test, their performance only sort of decreased by 15%, which is actually alright. But the last group, the ones who did it every 30 days, it's a very long time, they were really crap at it initially. But then at the end, the performance actually increased relative to the other groups. So they retained much more of what they were doing. Unfortunately, we only have 80 days until our exams, so you can't expect to do sort of a topic every 30 days. But what I'd suggest is that if we aim for somewhere in the middle of these two lines, so maybe doing a topic sort of in 1 week and then doing it again the next week or 2 weeks later, that seems to be sort of a pretty good area. This is what I did last year after I got this lecture. So I was like, oh wow, distributed study, let's do it. So I sort of made a list of all the topics down one side and would write down when I first studied the topic and then when I next did it, and would sort of aim to keep sort of a distance of 1 or 2 weeks between these intervals. So yeah, I think 1 or 2 weeks is pretty good. It hits the sweet spot between like 1 day and 30 days, which you don't have. But I couldn't actually find any sort of official evidence for that, so that's just my opinion. And if we go to the take-home message, cramming is better for the short term, as we all know. But spacing revision over time is much better in the long term, and because we have 80 days, this definitely counts as long term. So if you do this sort of distributed practice thing, this will really improve your marks. I can almost guarantee it. And yeah, 1 to 2 weeks seems, it worked for me. I'm pretty sure it'll work for you as well, as opposed to cramming, for example. Cool. Now finally, active retrieval or practice testing. This is the most underrated of all tactics, and is the most powerful of them all, which is why we left it to last. This famous dude, Thorndike, that no one has ever heard of, he was quite famous for his views on eugenics, but apart from that, he actually had something good to say about active recall. He said, the active recall of a fact from within is, as a rule, better than its impression from without, which I'll explain in a sec. So we all hate testing ourselves, but this is unfortunate because more than 100 years of research and several hundred experiments have shown that practice testing enhances learning and retention. Those are not my words, those are the words of Rawson and Donlowski, who are big names in psychology. Cool. Just a couple of studies just to drive this point home. These guys had a standard sort of, one group studied a subject and had a practice test. The other group just studied the subject twice. This is the performance of the people who were tested, sort of practice, and this is the performance of the people who weren't. And this works for everyone, the clever people and the not so clever people. The same thing applies. The next study shows that the same thing applies to facts and concepts. Again, one group had a practice test, the other group just restudied the subject twice. And in some cases, the practice test group did twice as good, even though they only sort of studied it once and tested themselves once, as opposed to people who studied it twice. The last one I'm going to talk about is quite fun. So basically, they had loads and loads of people and they divided them into 4 groups. The first group was supposed to study this one paragraph of text once. The second group was supposed to study the paragraph in 4 consecutive study periods. So they studied it once, and then again, and then again, and then again. The third group studied it once and made a mind map. And the fourth group studied it once and then tested themselves on it. And these 2 groups had the same time spent, so they controlled for time, if you really care about that. Now the results of this are actually really telling. So if we look at the first bit, this is the performance of the people who just studied this paragraph once. They were tested on some various aspects of it afterwards. These are the results of the group who studied it 4 times. So studying 4 times only actually increases your performance by, I don't know, less than 50%. And yeah, something similar over there, actually twice as good. This is the result of the people who used mind mapping. Mind mapping is always overhyped in the media as being like, oh my gosh, mind mapping is amazing. But it's sort of equivalent to studying it 4 times. In terms of time though, like, you're studying this topic 4 times, and you're just sort of studying it once in the mind mapping. So it's better to obviously mind map and study once than it is to study 4 times. That takes much, much longer. But most interestingly, the last group did the best of all, and they're the ones who just studied the topic once and then practice tested themselves. And that alone got them a significantly higher sort of proportion correct on this test than the people who studied it 4 times. So studying something 4 times is not efficient at all. Studying it just once and testing yourself is the most efficient tactic of them all. Interestingly, they then asked these participants sort of beforehand to like what they thought the results of this study would be, and that's what's shown on the next one. So everyone thought that studying something 4 times is going to be the maximum, sort of the most efficient strategy, and everyone underrated this topic of this sort of concept of practice testing. And sort of having spoken to loads of people about this, like it seems that everyone underrates practice testing, which is quite sad because it's by far the most efficient way of maximizing sort of the amount of information you retain. And take-home message is, yep, reading once and then testing yourself once is better than rereading 4 times. I'm going to keep on repeating this because it's very important. Please test yourself. Yes, it's hard, it takes mental effort, mental exertion, but ultimately, it's very, 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 very efficient. And that's, yeah, next one. Cool. So that's sort of the 5 main techniques that psychologists have decided tend to improve your retention. I'm just going to go over 3 quick ones that everyone actually uses but are actually not very good. So that's rereading, highlighting, and summarization. And I'm sure all of us, like I do all of these to this day, and I'm just trying to phase them out because they're really not very good at all. So, rereading. Loads of studies, as well as everyone's experience, tells us that students are heavily reliant on rereading. This is very effective. You just have to sit there and read a book and you think you're being productive because you've read the lecture notes. You're like, oh, I've read the lecture notes 3 times today. I must be doing something good. But unfortunately, it's the least effective technique. And the others we've talked about are much, much better. So if you read it once and then test yourself, that's much, much, much better than just reading it 5 times. Cool. Highlighting and underlining appeals to absolutely everyone. Like literally everyone highlights those things. But the question that one famous study asked was, does something that simple actually help you learn? Fowler and Barker, 1974, were quite fun. They got loads of undergrads to read an 8,000 word article, and they split them into 3 groups. The first group was a control group, they just read the article. The second group was exposed to passive highlighting. That means the text was already highlighted with like some expert in the field highlighting the most important bits. And the third group sort of actively highlighted the bits, and they were told to highlight the most important things, which is what we do when highlighting. But when tested a week later, the active highlighting group did no better than the control group, and the passive highlighting group fared no differently. So ultimately, whether you just read something, or whether you read it and highlight it at the same time, makes 0 difference to whether you actually retain the information. And this has been replicated across loads and loads of studies, and I couldn't be bothered to list them all. Cool. And again. So in most situations that have been examined, and with most participants, highlighting does very little to boost performance. Some studies have shown that it does, and anecdotal evidence suggests that sort of you talk to people about it, and they think, oh, I love highlighting, it's the best thing in my life. But like, if you look at the studies, it doesn't really do very much. Yeah, so there was this study said it might help for like really, really difficult texts where you actually sort of have to highlight. Like if you get a paragraph and most of it is irrelevant, you just highlight the relevant bit that you want to read in the future. But on tasks that require inference making, so a lot of art subjects, for example, that's actually not a good tactic at all. And this again, the same big name. He said when students are using a highlighter, they often focus on one concept at a time and are less likely to integrate the information they're reading into a larger whole. This could undermine comprehension of that material, which is not what we want. This professor dude, though, he did say that we should not abandon highlighters entirely, because his words were they're a good safety blanket for students who feel who get the endorphin release from feeling like they're working. So highlighting a text makes you feel good about yourself, like more good about it than reading it does, but really it doesn't actually help much, unfortunately. Sorry about that. And because I know people are going to still be mutinous about this, Presley et al. Said many students are committed to ineffective strategies, and Donofsky again said recent surveys have indicated that students most often endorse the use of rereading and highlighting, 2 strategies that we found to have relatively low utility. So I'll just throw that out. And finally, summarization is also very, very popular, but again, pretty useless. It's better than just rereading, obviously, because you do have to engage in some processing, but it's a waste of time. It tends to fall in the middle of the pack when compared to other techniques. Like, there's about 10 or 12 different sort of techniques that people use, and like 4 or 5 of them are effective, and those are the ones we've talked about. Summarization sort of is like the 6th or the 7th on the list. So it works, yeah, but like, why would you summarize something when you can, test yourself on it and retain it much better instead? So what I would recommend, and what I did last year, was instead of summarizing lecture notes, which we all love because it feels really, really productive, doesn't it? Try and actively remember them. Because this engages both the deeper processing, because you have to deeply process information to write exam questions about it, and it also engages the whole active recall thing, because you're actively testing yourself as you're going along, rather than just rereading multiple times and hoping everything's going to work out. Cool. So the bottom line, these are the things to do. Yep, number 1, process information deeply, don't just memorize it. Number 2, process it elaborately. Think about connections between material, hang the details onto the bigger structure, that kind of thing. Organize information into logical structures, like answers to essay questions. This is very, very good. Worked examples are also, by the way, they've done loads of studies on them for like mathematics and engineers and stuff. And those are very good. Space your study sessions as much as possible, obviously not like every month, but maybe every week or every 2 weeks. And finally, try to retrieve information. The active retrieval of information is actually more important than just revising the same topic again. So that's like the most important thing, the one at the bottom. And things to avoid are summarizing lecture notes, rereading lecture notes, and just highlighting and underlining lecture notes. Yes, you can still do that, I still do that, but try and do this other stuff as well. It really does help. Cool. Just a few random things to end with that people always ask about. The first one is, should you listen to music while studying? Most studies suggest that no, you shouldn't, because it decreases performance. Music with lyrics is the worst of all, because when you hear words and when you read words, that engages the same like attentional processes in the brain, and you end up being distracted by the lyrics regardless of how much you think they help you concentrate, according to these studies. But there is a lot of variation. Like, this is all just trends. So if you find that you can't concentrate without listening to like some black rap, then please go for it. Like, genuinely. But yeah. So basically do what you think works for you. But if you're in doubt, and then silence is better than everything. Instrumental music is better than lyrics. But if you have to concentrate with lyrics, then go for it. And finally, sleep and naps. This is just stuff we all know. You should get a lot of sleep because your memories are consolidated while you sleep. If you're practicing a musical instrument or something and you sleep, that's when you actually get the muscle memory. If you're revising a subject and then you sleep, that's when it goes into your memory properly. Daytime naps have also been linked into improved cognitive performance and memory consolidation. If you're really interested, you can read these reviews, but they're like 500 pages long. So I didn't really bother, I just referenced them. But yeah, so naps are also a good thing, and the whole classic 8 hours of sleep a night is good. There's a reason they say it's good, because it helps your memory improve. So it's good to have sleep during exam term. And staying up all night is not good, but you knew that already. Cool. So we're just going to end with summarizing this again. Please process information deeply. Please process information elaborately. Please organize this information into logical structures, like answers to essay questions or work examples to questions. Space your study sessions as much as possible. Don't do everything in one go. And finally, and most importantly, test yourself as you're going along, because that's what's going to help you remember stuff in the exam. And again, the other stuff is a bit useless, really. Just a quick special thanks to Dr. Saxida. She's like this really cool psychologist in the psychology department, and she gave the lecture on this last year and very kindly gave me the slides to use. So I copied a lot from them. And finally, because as part of the Islamic Society's whole thing about improving academic performance and stuff, we've got a series of talks next term, by people much more intelligent than I am, who came top 10 in Tripos in various subjects. And these are going to be subject-specific talks on how to smash your exams for maybe medicine, maths, engineering. I think we have some lawyers who came very highly ranked as well. So look out for those. You can like our Facebook page to get more information. And finally,